Now, we switch to the system and walk through each step to understand the configuration in action. To start the configuration session, this is the login screen. The user will enter the username and password, and then click on the login button. Upon successful login, the home screen will appear with some useful default widgets and charts. To access the screen, navigate to HR Management, then General Setup, and then Input Value. Now, as you can see on the screen, a few input values are already created with different names such as amount, input value, pay_value, and percentage. These input values will be used later during the configuration process. This is the first step where you can define the name of the input value and simply save the record. Next, move to Component Classification. Navigate to General Setup, then Component Classification. Here, we have defined different classifications like earning, deduction, exemption, and contribution. Based on your requirements, you can define the classification here. Later, this classification will be mapped to the component to categorize or differentiate it properly. Now, move to the Balance Dimension Master. Go to General Setup and click on Balance Dimension Master. Once the screen opens, you can define various balance dimensions, such as Assignment Default Run, Year-to-Date YTD, and Inception-to-Date ITD. These dimensions decide how the component value will accumulate in the balance once the payroll is processed. Next, we have the Balance Definition screen. Go to General Setup and click on Balance Definition. Here, you can see a few balances already created, such as Earning Component Balance, Deduction Balance, Basic Salary Balance, and EPF Balance. For each balance, we first define the balance dimension. When we click on the Balance Dimension tab, you can see that two dimensions have been created for the Earning Component Balance, Assignment Default Run, and Year-to-Date. Now, coming back to the header, the next tab is Linked Component. When the user clicks on this tab, they can view all the components that are linked to the selected balance. In this example, the Earning Component Balance is linked to Basic Salary, Attendance Allowance, Arrears Basic Salary, and HRA. This means that the values from all these earning components will be accumulated into this balance, as long as the balance is attached to those components. These balances will be mapped to multiple components based on the requirement. Now move to Component Definition. Go to General Setup and click on Component Definition. Here, you can create payroll or legislation-related components. You can define the component name, priority, and processing type. In the Input Value tab, you can link the required input values to the component. Once this is completed, you can tag the appropriate balance to the component. Let us take an example for a tax deduction. Here, the component name is defined, along with the component classification set as deduction. You can also see the start date, processing priority, and process type configured for this component. Next, we move to the Input Value tab. Here, the input value is saved as pay value, and its data type is defined as amount. Now, coming back to the header, the next tab is the Balance Feed tab. In this section, the input value selected is pay value, and the balance linked to this component is the deduction balance. The data type is again defined as amount, since the purpose of this component is to contribute its value into the deduction balance. The Add or Subtract field is set to Add, meaning the pay value will be added into that balance. This is how users can create records for various payroll components in the system. After defining the component, we move to the component link. Go to General Setup and click on Component Link. The components created in the previous screen will be linked here. In this window, you can see that links are created for all the components defined on the Component Definition screen. The component names will be available for selection in the Component Type field. Simply enter the start date and save the record. Once the component link is created, it can then be assigned to an employee, and the system will automatically process it during the payroll run. Next is the table structure. Go to General Setup and click on Table Structure. Here, we define slabs for various purposes such as job, grade, position, or salary ranges. For example, we have created a table with the name tax regime. The search key is also defined as tax regime, the match type is set to range, and the key measure type is selected as number. Next, in the column tab, we define the search key and specify the column name as tax regime slab. After this, we return to the header screen and open the row tab. Here, we define the salary ranges, along with the start date and end date for each slab. Once the table structure is ready, go to the Table Value screen. Navigate to General Setup, then Table Value. Here, you can see that a record has been created. We first select the user table as tax regime, which we created earlier. Based on this selection, the key measurement type and match type are automatically populated. Next, we move to the Column tab, where the user column is selected as tax regime slab. Finally, in the Row tab, the user row shows all available salary ranges in a drop-down. Here, the range 1 to 4 lakh is selected, and the value is entered as 5, which represents 5% tax. This percentage will be applied when the system calculates tax for this salary slab. Based on the selected user row, the lower range and upper range fields will auto-populate accordingly. Now, move to the tax setup. Navigate to the salary.io folder and open the tax setup screen. In this section, the user can define how income tax should be calculated. The tax value can be derived from 3 possible sources, which are user table, balance, or remaining periods. Based on the selected tax value source, the relevant fields will be enabled. In this example, I have selected balance. After selecting this option, I define the balance name from the drop-down, and then choose the balance dimension from which the system should pick the final value for tax calculation. If we are in the month of December and the previous period's balance needs to be considered, the user can mark the corresponding checkbox as true. By configuring these parameters, users can define the tax setup rules based on the available tax value source to determine the correct value required for tax computation. These criteria will later be used within the formula to calculate the final tax result. Next, move to the Database function. Go to General Setup and open the Database function screen. Once the screen opens, you will see that some functions are already defined. These functions will later be used inside formulas to pick specific values or to reference particular fields during payroll processing. In the second tab, you can see the function parameters. Here, the user needs to define the parameters that the function will require, for example, CB partner ID, start date, and end date. These 3 parameters help the system fetch the correct information when the function is used. Next, we have the DB item static. Go to General Setup and click on DB items. Once the screen opens, you will see a list of DB items that have already been saved. Whenever you create data in any configuration screen where the Generate DB item checkbox is available, the system automatically generates the DB item when you save the record. However, there are some DB items that need to be defined manually. These are used when you want to fetch values from specific fields, such as employee date of joining, marital status, date of birth, and so on. These are called static DB items, and they play an important role in formulas, as they allow the system to pick up predefined field values during payroll calculations. Next, we have the Formula Master. Go to General Setup and open the Formula Master screen. Once all the configuration steps explained earlier in this video are completed, the user will use those details here to define the calculation rules. In this screen, the user needs to enter the formula name, write the calculation logic in the formula text, and then save the record. After saving, click on the Compile button to validate the formula and make it ready for use. If there is any error during compilation, the system will display the details in the error message field. If everything is correct, the system will show Compile Successful. Lastly, we have the Formula Result screen. Go to General Setup and open the Formula Result screen. Here, the user will bind the formula with the component. First, Select the component for which the formula has been written. Then select the formula from the drop-down and save the record. Next, move to the Return Result tab. This is where the user defines the return values. The sequence you set here decides what result will be displayed first, and which component will receive the calculated value. For example, the calculated tax amount will be directly saved into the tax deduction component. Similarly, the percentage applied while calculating the tax will be returned indirectly to another component, such as tax deduction percentage. Based on the component type defined earlier, this will become the triggering component, which will later be tagged to the employee. The configuration of the legislation setup is now complete. In the next section, we will move on to the transaction screens. That concludes this session. Thank you for attending.